Maya always felt like her life was a series of binary codes, a strict division between the woman who dominated boardrooms and the woman who navigated the city's shadows. By day, she was the ice queen of corporate cybersecurity at Hanmu Electronics. Her natural hair slicked into a bun so tight it felt like a physical anchor to her professional identity. She was the woman who turned quarterly projections into art, earning bows of genuine respect from colleagues who saw only her sharp blazers and sharper mind. But as the clock struck 5, that version of Maya vanished. She shed the corporate armor for a burnt orange silk slip dress that caught the dim light of the obsidian vault like a warning flare, transforming into a digital scavenger hunting for the breadcrumbs of her brother's devastating gambling debts. The air inside the VVIP lounge was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the low, hypnotic thrum of bass that seemed to synchronize with the heartbeat of Seoul's elite. Maya moved through the crowd with a practiced, invisible grace, her tray of smoking lychee vodka drinks serving as the perfect camouflage. She was analyzing the room's patterns, her eyes scanning for the specific high roller who held her family's fate in his hands when the world simply ceased to exist. The blackout was instantaneous and violent. It wasn't a mere power surge, it was a sensory vacuum that sucked the glamour out of the room, replaced immediately by the terrified screams of socialites and the rhythmic, terrifying clack-clack of automatic weapons being readied in the dark. Maya didn't think. She reacted. Growing up with 3 brothers had gifted her with competitive, survivalist instincts that overrode the polished director Kim persona. Disoriented by the sudden vacuum of light, she lunged for what she thought was a heavy velvet armchair, a sanctuary in the brewing storm. She hit something solid, but it wasn't furniture. Instead of a hard surface, she landed squarely on a warm, expansive lap, her silk-clad thighs pressing against the rough texture of a tailored suit. A gasp caught in her throat as the emergency lights flickered to life, casting a dim, hellish red glow over the scene. The room was no longer a party, it was a firing squad. A dozen men in sharp suits stood frozen around the table, their guns leveled with lethal intent toward the very spot where Maya had fallen. Maya scrambled to stand, in her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but a hand like a velvet-covered vice locked firmly around her waist. It wasn't a pull, it was an anchor. She felt the cold, unmistakable steel of a holster beneath the man's jacket as he drew her flush against his chest. Slowly, she turned her head, meeting eyes that were like shards of cold flint, dark and unreadable in the crimson light. This was Ji-hoon, the ghost boss, a man whose very name made the powerful people of Seoul whisper in fearful reverence. He looked at her not with shock, but with a terrifying, predatory calm, as if she were the only interesting thing in a room full of loaded weapons. As she opened her mouth to protest, to beg for release from this accidental target on her back, he leaned in. His breath was hot against her neck, a stark contrast to the icy sandalwood cologne that enveloped her. "Remain there," he whispered. The command was quiet, cultured, and absolute. It wasn't just a request for her to stay still, it was a public claim. By holding her there, centered in the crosshairs of his enemies, he was shielding her with his own terrifying reputation, transforming her in a single heartbeat from an anonymous waitress into the most targeted woman in the city. Maya froze, the ice queen melting under the weight of a gaze that saw through every version of herself she had ever built. The corporate world was miles away. Here, in the lap of the underworld, the game had finally begun. The red emergency lights continued to pulse like a dying star, casting long, jagged shadows across the wreckage of the lounge. Maya could feel the vibration of Ji-hoon's chest against her back, a steady, terrifying rhythm that didn't skip a beat even as the heavy doors at the far end of the vault were kicked open. The silhouette of tactical gear and the blinding beams of high-intensity flashlights cut through the haze. It was a collision of 2 predators, the law and the lawless. Ji-hoon's grip on her waist tightened, his fingers splaying across the orange silk of her dress with a possessiveness that felt like a brand. Maya tried to shift, her mind racing through a dozen exit strategies, but his other hand rose to cup her jaw, forcing her to look at him. Up close, the ghost boss was a masterpiece of lethal symmetry. There was no panic in his dark eyes, only a calculating stillness that made her breath hitch. "If you move now," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear over the shouting of the tactical teams. "You are just another casualty in a crossfire. If you stay, you are the most protected woman in Seoul. Choose quickly, Director Kim." The use of her professional title hit her like a physical blow. He knew. He had seen through the burnt orange silk and the server's tray to the woman who sat in the high-backed chairs of Hanmu Electronics. Before she could find her voice, a commanding shout echoed through the room. A police captain, flanked by officers with rifles raised, stepped into the crimson light. "Min Ji-hoon, hands where we can see them. We have a warrant for a sweep of this entire facility." The men around the table, Ji-hoon's lieutenants, didn't move their hands from their holsters. The tension was a physical weight. A thin wire stretched to the point of snapping. One wrong twitch would turn the room into a slaughterhouse. Ji-hoon didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like a velvet rasp. He didn't let go of Maya. Instead, he tucked her head into the crook of his neck and looked up at the captain with a bored, aristocratic disdain. "Captain Park," Ji-hoon said, his voice carrying with an effortless authority that silenced the room. "You've always had a flair for the dramatic, but your timing is atrocious. You've terrified my fiancé." The word fiancé rippled through the air, more effective than a flashbang. Maya felt the eyes of every officer, every rival hiding in the shadows, and every one of Ji-hoon's men lock onto her. She felt the heat rise to her cheeks. The ice queen of the boardroom suddenly thrust into a performance she hadn't auditioned for. "Fiancé?" the captain spat, though his rifle lowered by a fraction of an inch. "We've tracked your movements for months, Ji-hoon. You don't have a fiancé, you have targets." "Then you haven't been looking closely enough," Ji-hoon replied. He stood up slowly, bringing Maya with him. He didn't let her feet touch the ground fully until he was steady, keeping his arm draped over her shoulders, pulling her into the shelter of his side. "Maya has been the best-kept secret of my organization, and considering the current security breach, I think it's time I take her home." He began to walk. It was the most reckless thing Maya had ever experienced. He didn't wait for permission. He simply moved toward the gauntlet of police and the hidden eyes of the hit squad that had triggered the blackout. He used her as a human shield, but not in the way she had expected. He didn't put her in front of him to take a bullet. He used her presence to create a political vacuum. To shoot him now, in front of the cameras that were undoubtedly being held by the paparazzi waiting outside, would be to shoot a high society couple in the middle of a misunderstood date. As they neared the exit, a man stepped out from the shadows near the coat check, a rival with a jagged scar across his temple and a silenced pistol held low. His eyes were fixed on Ji-hoon's heart. Maya felt the shift in Ji-hoon's posture, the subtle tensing of the muscle in his shoulder. He wasn't going to reach for his weapon. He was waiting to see if the police would intervene or if the rival would gamble on a public execution. Maya's corporate brain, the one that analyzed risks and predicted failures, surged to the surface. She leaned heavily into Ji-hoon, feigning a feint, her body blocking the rival's clear line of sight to Ji-hoon's vitals, while simultaneously drawing the attention of two nearby officers. "She's in shock," she cried out, her voice trembling with a perfect mix of feminine frailty and genuine terror. The distraction worked. The police moved in to assist, effectively creating a wall of blue between the rival's gun and Ji-hoon. Ji-hoon's eyes flickered down to her, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. He understood exactly what she had done. He swept her up into his arms, carrying her past the threshold and into the chaotic night air of Seoul. Outside, The world was a frenzy of blue and red strobes. The paparazzi were a pack of wolves, their flashes firing like miniature lightning bolts. Ji-hoon didn't stop to give a statement. He moved toward a sleek black armored sedan that had idled at the curb. He tossed her into the back seat and slid in beside her, the heavy door closing with a thud that silenced the world outside. The car accelerated instantly, weaving through the neon-lit streets of Gangnam with a predatory speed. Maya scrambled to the far side of the seat, her orange dress bunched around her knees, her breath coming in jagged gasps. She looked at the man beside her. He was calmly straightening his cuffs, the lethal ghost boss once again looking like a bored billionaire. "You're a very good actress, Maya," he said, not looking at her. "Or perhaps you're just a very fast learner." "I'm not your fiancé," she snapped, her voice finally finding its edge. "And I'm not a shield. I was there for my brother." Ji-hoon turned his head slowly. The flickering streetlights outside cast alternating bands of light and shadow across his face. "Your brother owes me a debt that his life cannot pay. But you? You just saved mine in front of the Seoul Metropolitan Police." He leaned forward, the sandalwood scent of his cologne filling her lungs again. "That makes you much more than a server, and far more than a director. It makes you mine until the debt is settled." Maya looked out the window as the city blurred into a streak of gold. She had spent 3 years building a safe life, a predictable life. But as the car sped toward a destination she didn't know, she realized that the Ice Queen had finally been caught in a fire she couldn't extinguish. The armored sedan ascended the private ramp of a skyscraper that pierced the Seoul skyline like a glass needle. Maya watched the city floor fall away, the neon veins of Gangnam shrinking into a distant glowing map. Beside her, Ji-hoon remained a statue of dark silk and cold intent, his silence more suffocating than the high-speed chase they had just escaped. When the car hissed to a halt inside a sterile, silver-tiled garage, the door was opened by a man whose suit was so sharp it looked like a weapon itself. Ji-hoon stepped out first, extending a hand toward her. Maya stared at his palm, strong, calloused, and utterly deceptive. She ignored it, gathering the hem of her burnt orange dress and stepping onto the cold concrete herself. She was a director at Hanmu. She didn't need a hand to find her footing, even if the world felt like it was tilting on a precarious axis. They moved toward a private elevator that required both a biometric scan and a physical keycard. As the doors slid shut, sealing them in a box of mirrors, Maya caught her reflection. Her hair was beginning to spill from its pins, the thick coils framing a face that looked far more haunted than the Ice Queen she presented to the world. She looked like a woman who had just survived a war, only to realize she had been captured by the victor. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse that redefined the concept of power. It wasn't a home, it was a command center draped in luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree view of the city, making the lights of Seoul look like a carpet of jewels laid out for Ji-hoon's amusement. The floors were polished obsidian, reflecting the minimalist furniture and the jagged, expensive art that lined the walls. But Maya's eyes weren't on the view. They were on the large mahogany desk at the far end of the room, where a single manila folder sat waiting under a spotlight. "Drink?" Ji-hoon asked, walking toward a bar carved from a single block of marble. He didn't wait for an answer, pouring 2 fingers of an amber liquid that smelled of peat and ancient history. "I want to go home," Maya said, her voice echoing in the vast hollow space. "The performance is over. Your rivals are gone. The police are satisfied. Bon and I've fulfilled whatever shield duty you think I owed you." Ji-hoon turned, the crystal glass catching the light as he swirled the whiskey. "The performance has barely begun, Maya, and you are home, for as long as it takes for us to discuss the mathematics of your family's failures." He gestured toward the desk. Maya felt a cold dread settle in the pit of her stomach, a sensation far worse than the guns at the casino. She walked toward the folder, her heels clicking like a countdown on the obsidian floor. When she reached the desk, she saw the name scrawled across the tab in sharp, precise Hangul. Kim Sunwoo. She opened the folder. Her breath hitched. It wasn't just a list of losses. It was a ledger of a life being dismantled. I owe us from 3 different underground dens, to high-interest loans from shell companies she recognized as fronts for the syndicate, and a final, staggering sum at the bottom that made her vision swim. It was more than her brother could earn in 10 lifetimes. It was more than her executive salary could ever cover. Sunwoo was ambitious, Ji-hoon said, his voice coming from directly behind her. She hadn't heard him move. He thought he could play the ghost and win. He didn't realize that in this city, the house doesn't just win, the house owns you. Maya turned, her back hitting the edge of the mahogany desk. Ji-hoon was inches away, the scent of sandalwood and expensive whiskey surrounding her. He placed the glass on the desk next to the folder, his arm boxing her in. I was at that casino tonight to find the man who held these, Maya whispered, gesturing to the papers. I didn't realize I was sitting on his lap the whole time. Life is full of poetic ironies, Ji-hoon murmured. He reached out, his thumb catching a stray coil of her hair and tucking it behind her ear. The touch was light, but it carried the weight of a heavy chain. Your brother didn't just lose money, Maya. He lost a shipment. Something far more valuable than paper currency. My associates wanted to dispose of him in the Han River 3 weeks ago. I was the one who suggested a stay of execution. Why? She challenged, her chin lifting. A man like you doesn't do favors out of the goodness of his heart. Because I knew he had a sister, Ji-hoon said, his dark eyes searching hers with a terrifying intensity. A sister who is a genius with digital encryption. A sister who has spent the last 3 years building a perfect corporate life while secretly hacking into my shell companies to track her brother's movements. Maya froze. The Ice Queen facade finally shattered, leaving her raw and exposed. She had thought she was invisible, a ghost in the machine, but she had been under his microscope the entire time. I don't need a waitress, Maya, and despite my announcement to the police, I don't need a fiancé, he said, his voice dropping to a low, cultured rasp that sent a shiver down her spine. I need a key. Your brother's life is the price of your talent. You will work for me here, in this den, as you call it. You will secure my interests and dismantle my enemy's firewalls. He leaned in closer until their foreheads were almost touching. The world thinks you are mine now. Let them believe it. It's the only thing keeping you and Sunwoo alive. Maya looked at the ledger, then back at the man who held her future in his steady, lethal hands. She had walked into the casino to save her brother, but as she stood in the heart of the ghost's empire, she realized she hadn't just sat on a lap, she had sat on a throne of thorns, and there was no getting up. Do we have an agreement, Director Kim? Maya looked at the city lights below, realization dawning on her. She was no longer a player in the game. She was the prize. Yes, she whispered, the word tasting like ash. We have an agreement. Ji-hoon smiled, a slow, devastating curve of his lips that didn't reach his cold eyes. Good. Now, go change. Orange is a color for targets, and from tomorrow, you will be the one pulling the trigger. The morning sun didn't so much rise as it did strike the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse, turning the obsidian floors into a blinding lake of light. Maya hadn't slept. She had spent the night wrapped in a silk robe that felt like a shroud, staring at the digital pulse of the city she no longer belonged to. When the heavy door to the study slid open, she didn't turn. She knew the sound of his footsteps now, deliberate, rhythmic, and heavy with the weight of absolute power. Ji-hoon entered with a tray of black coffee and a slim silver laptop that looked like a surgical instrument. He placed them on the low marble table between 2 velvet armchairs and sat, gesturing for her to join him. There was no mention of the orange dress she had discarded, nor the terrifying claim he had made to the police. This morning, he was all business, his white shirt crisp and his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that told a story of violence hidden beneath a veneer of elegance. The interest on Sunwoo's debt is compounding by the hour, Ji-hoon began, his voice devoid of the dark playfulness from the night before. He slid the laptop toward her. I am a man of acquisitions, Maya. I acquire assets, and I liquidate liabilities. Currently, your brother is a liability that has cost me 3 billion won and a disrupted supply chain. You, however, are a potential asset. Maya sat across from him, the heat of the coffee steaming between them. She felt the ice queen of Hanmu Electronics trying to reassemble herself, pulling the fragments of her professional pride from the wreckage of her life. You want me to hack for you? You want a backdoor into the rival syndicates that are trying to squeeze your territory. I want more than a backdoor, Ji-hoon corrected, leaning back. I want a God view. There is a faction within the Seven Stars, the group that triggered the blackout at the vault, that is moving their capital through a series of encrypted blockchain nodes I cannot crack. They are buying politicians, police captains, and my own men. I need you to find the leak. I need you to bleed them dry before they can finalize their next move. Maya looked at the laptop. To touch it was to cross a line she could never uncross. If I do this, what happens to Sunwoo? His debt is frozen the moment you begin. The moment you deliver the names and the account access, his debt is erased. He will be given a one-way ticket to a location of his choosing outside of Korea, and he will be forbidden from ever returning to Seoul. He lives, but he disappears. And me? Maya asked, her gaze meeting his flint-like eyes. Do I get a ticket too? Ji-hoon's expression shifted, a subtle tightening at the corners of his mouth. You stay. You've already been seen on my lap, Maya. You've been branded as mine. If I let you go now, you wouldn't make it to the airport. My enemies would take you just to see if they could make me bleed through you. So it's not just a job, she whispered, her fingers hovering over the silver casing of the laptop. It's an indentured servitude. It's survival, he countered. In your world, you call it a merger. In mine, it's a surrender. You give me your mind, your skills, and your loyalty. In exchange, I give you my protection and your brother's heart still beating in his chest. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling empire he commanded. I don't expect you to like me, Maya. I don't even expect you to trust me. But I know you love your family more than your morality, and I know you're bored with corporate firewalls that take you 10 minutes to bypass. Give yourself a real challenge. Maya felt the pull of the abyss. He was right. About her brother, and about the dark, restless part of her that craved a problem she couldn't solve with a standard script. She opened the laptop. The screen glowed, illuminating the sharp lines of her face. The Ice Queen was gone. In her place was a woman who was about to set the underworld on fire. I have conditions, Maya said, her voice steady. I work from here. When I have access to my own servers, and you stay out of my code, I don't work with people looking over my shoulder. Ji-hoon turned back from the window, a genuine predatory spark of appreciation in his eyes. Deal. Welcome to the Ghost's inner circle, Director Kim. Try not to break anything too expensive. The Grand Hyatt's ballroom was a cathedral of glass and gold, illuminated by chandeliers that hung like frozen explosions above Seoul's elite. For Maya, the evening was a masterclass in psychological warfare. She was no longer wearing the burnt orange silk of a desperate sister, or the sharp blazer of a corporate director. Tonight, Ji-hoon had draped her in a gown of midnight velvet that clung to her curves like a second skin, paired with diamonds that felt like cold shackles against her throat. As they descended the grand staircase, and the ambient noise of 1,000 high society conversations died a sudden, synchronized death. Every eye in the room, from the aging chaebol heads to the razor-thin starlets, tracked their movement. The ghost boss was no longer a myth whispered in shadows. He was a physical presence, and he was holding the waist of the woman who had allegedly brought him to his knees at the obsidian vault. "Keep your head up," Ji-hoon murmured, his voice a ghost of a sound against her ear. "You aren't a guest, Maya. You're the centerpiece. If you look like you're searching for an exit, they'll smell the blood in the water." "I've spent my life in boardrooms, Ji-hoon," Maya replied, her lips barely moving as she maintained a serene, practiced smile. "I know how to handle sharks. And I just didn't realize I'd be dancing with the great white." He led her into the center of the floor as the orchestra transitioned into a slow, haunting waltz. He moved with a grace that was deceptively fluid, a predator's rhythm that forced her to follow. When he pulled her close, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back, the heat of his body through the velvet made the Ice Queen facade difficult to maintain. "You're doing it again," he said, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Doing what?" "Analyzing," he noted. "You're calculating the distance to the doors, the number of security personnel in the corners, and the exact frequency of the digital signals in the room. You're looking for data points because you're afraid of the feeling." Maya stiffened, her fingers tightening on his shoulder. "I'm doing my job. I have the bug in my clutch. I need to get close to the Minister of Trade's table to initiate the uplink." "The bug is a distraction, Maya," Ji-hoon said, his gaze intensifying until she felt stripped bare. "You're using the mission to hide. You think that if you stay in Director Kim mode, I can't touch the woman underneath. But I saw her at the casino. I saw the woman who lunges into the dark to save her blood. I saw the girl who used her brother's competitive games to outsmart a room full of killers." The music seemed to swell, drowning out the rest of the world. For a moment, the gala vanished. There were no cameras, no rivals, no debts. There was only the weight of his hand and the terrifying realization that he wasn't looking at her as a tool or a trophy. He was looking at her as a mirror. "Everyone else in this room sees the orange dress or the velvet gown," Ji-hoon continued, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in her bones. "They see the fiancé or the Ice Queen. But I see the woman who's tired of carrying the world on her shoulders. I see the woman who wants to be reckless just once, without a backup plan." Maya's breath caught. She had spent 3 years building a life of perfect, sterile isolation to protect her family, convincing herself that she was content with the cold logic of numbers. But in the arms of a man who dealt in blood and shadows, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a decade. The thrill of being truly known. "You're a dangerous man, Kong Ji-hoon," she whispered, her voice trembling with more than just the effort of the dance. "I am," he agreed, a slow, genuine smile ghosting across his lips. One that held no malice, only a dark, shared recognition. "But I'm the only one in this room who isn't lying to you." The waltz ended, the silence of the room returning like a cold front. Ji-hoon didn't let her go immediately. He lingered, his thumb tracing a small possessive circle on her hip before stepping back to play the part of the doting consort once more. As the socialites began to swarm them, Maya realized the danger had shifted. She wasn't afraid of the hitmen in the corners anymore. She was afraid of the man standing beside her, because he had done the one thing no firewall could prevent. He had found a way in. The champagne in Maya's crystal flute trembled, though her hand was steady. They were moving toward the balcony of the Grand Hyatt, and the cool night air a desperate relief from the suffocating perfumed heat of the ballroom. Ji-hoon was in the middle of a sentence, a sharp-edged remark about the minister's dwindling offshore accounts, when the world fractured. It wasn't a blackout this time. It was a symphony of breaking glass. The high-velocity round shattered the heavy French doors, spraying diamond-like shards across the velvet of Maya's gown. Before the sound of the rifle's report could even register in her brain, Ji-hoon's hand was a blur of motion. He didn't dive for cover. He didn't reach for the weapon tucked into his waistband. He lunged toward her, his body becoming a wall of muscle and dark silk. Maya felt the air leave her lungs as he tackled her to the marble floor, his weight shielding her entirely. A second shot whined through the space where her head had been a heartbeat before, embedding itself in the gilded pillar behind them. Screams erupted from the ballroom, high, jagged sounds that signaled the end of the evening's carefully curated civility. "Don't move," Ji-hoon hissed against her ear. It was the same command from the casino, but the tone had changed. The cultured rasp was gone, replaced by a raw, guttural intensity. Maya's cheek was pressed against the cold stone, her eyes wide as she watched a third bullet tear through the hem of her dress. She waited for the pressure of his body to vanish, for him to roll away and return fire, to treat her as the tactical liability she was. That was the calculus of his world, wasn't it? The boss survives. The assets are expendable. But he didn't move. He stayed hunched over her, his arms braced on either side of her head, his eyes scanning the rooftops across the plaza with a lethal focus. "Ji-hoon, you're open!" she gasped, her hands fisted in the lapels of his jacket. "Get down!" "I have you," he grunted, his jaw tight. A final shot rang out, followed by the muffled thwip of a silenced return fire from his security team positioned below. Maya felt a sudden, sharp jolt run through Ji-hoon's frame. He let out a low, choked sound, his forehead dropping to rest against her shoulder for a fleeting second before he forced himself back up. "You're hit," she whispered, her digital security brain suddenly flooded with a different kind of data, the warmth of a liquid spreading across the back of his charcoal jacket. The way his breathing had turned shallow and jagged. "It's a graze," he lied. The iron scent of blood began to compete with his sandalwood cologne. The security perimeter finally closed in, a phalanx of black-suited men forming a human wall around them. Only then did Ji-hoon allow himself to be helped up, though he kept one hand locked onto Maya's arm, pulling her with him as they were hurried toward the service elevator. Inside the small metallic box, the silence was deafening. Ji-hoon leaned against the wall, his face pale, the mask of the ghost boss slipping to reveal the exhaustion underneath. Maya reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the dark, wet stain on his shoulder. He had taken a round meant for her heart. He had bypassed every survival instinct he possessed to ensure she remained untouched. For years, Maya had operated on the belief that men like Ji-hoon were incapable of anything beyond cold acquisition. She had categorized him as a predator, a monster who used people like lines of code to be manipulated and discarded. But as she looked at the blood on her hands, his blood, the cynicism that had served as her armor for so long didn't just crack, it disintegrated. He hadn't shielded her because she was an asset. He hadn't protected her to save his investment. He had done it because, in the chaotic darkness of his world, she had become the only thing he wasn't willing to lose. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking in the quiet of the elevator. "I'm just a debt to be collected." Ji-hoon looked at her, his dark eyes clouded with pain but burning with an honesty that was more terrifying than any gun. "I told you, Maya. I don't believe in wasting time. And I wasn't about to let someone take the only real thing I've found in years." He slumped slightly as the elevator reached the garage, and for the first time, Maya didn't wait for him to lead. She stepped forward, catching him, her arm wrapping around his waist to steady him. The Ice Queen was gone, replaced by a woman who realized that the most dangerous thing in Seoul wasn't a rival's bullet. It was the man who had just died a little to keep her alive. The penthouse felt different in the silence of recovery. Less like a command center and more like a fortress under siege. For 3 days, Maya had traded her keyboard for bandages and antiseptic, her hands steady despite the internal storm. Ji-hoon was a restless patient, a man whose very existence was predicated on control, now forced into a vulnerability that made the air between them thick with unspoken truths. While Ji-hoon slept fitfully under the influence of heavy painkillers, Maya retreated to his study. She needed to work, to drown the memory of his blood on her velvet gown in the cold logic of data. She bypassed his primary security layers with a speed that would have terrified his lieutenants, diving deep into the encrypted archives of his private server. She told herself she was looking for the source of the Hyatt assassination attempt, but her fingers were pulled by a different gravity. She searched for the name that had brought her here, Kim Sun-woo. She expected to find more ledgers of debt, perhaps photos of her brother in compromising positions to be used as leverage. Instead, she found a hidden subdirectory labeled with a simple, anonymous string of numbers, her family's old address in Chicago. Maya's breath hitched as she breached the final firewall. Inside were dozens of files spanning the last 3 years. There were surveillance logs, but they weren't predatory. They were protective. She saw reports from a security firm in Illinois detail logging the movements of a local debt collection syndicate that had been sniffing around her mother's house. She found wire transfer receipts, not into her brother's gambling accounts, but into a private medical trust that had quietly covered their mother's hospital stay a year ago, disguised as an insurance payout. The most jarring discovery was a set of decrypted messages between Ji-hoon and a high-ranking member of the Seven Stars from 6 months prior. The rival had suggested kidnapping Maya to force Sun-woo to pay up. Ji-hoon's response was a single chilling line that made her skin prickle. "Touch the sister, and I will burn your lineage from the history books. She is not a pawn. She is off limits." Maya leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her eyes. All this time, she had played the role of the martyr, the Ice Queen sacrificing her soul to save her reckless brother from a monster. She had viewed Ji-hoon as the architect of her misery. But the data didn't lie. He hadn't been the predator lurking in the tall grass. He had been the apex predator keeping the scavengers at bay. He had let her believe he was the villain because it was the only way she would accept his proximity, the only way he could keep her close enough to guard. A soft sound at the door made her spin around. Ji-hoon stood there, pale and leaning heavily against the frame, his shoulder wrapped in thick gauze. He didn't look at the screen. He didn't have to. He saw the realization written in the tension of her shoulders and the wetness in her eyes. "You weren't supposed to find that," he said, his voice a rasp of its former self. "You let me hate you," Maya whispered, her voice cracking. "You let me think you were the one holding the knife to my family's throat, while you were actually standing in front of it." Ji-hoon moved slowly into the room, his gaze never leaving hers. "In my world, loyalty is a currency, Maya. But for people like us, it's a death sentence. If I had told you I was protecting them, you would have looked for a way to pay me back. You would have been soft. And softness gets people killed in soul." "Why did you do it?" she asked, standing up, and the distance between them feeling both miles wide and non-existent. "Before the casino, before the lap, before I ever hacked a single file for you." "Why?" Ji-hoon stopped a foot away from her. The sandalwood scent was faint now, replaced by the medicinal sharp of the penthouse. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a gentleness that shattered the last of her defenses. "Because you were the only thing in this city that didn't have a price. You were fighting for a family that didn't deserve you, with a brilliance that terrified me. I didn't want to own you, Maya. I wanted to see if someone like you could actually survive someone like me." Maya realized then that the code of loyalty wasn't a set of rules they followed. It was a bond they had been forging in the dark. And she didn't see a boss or a debt collector anymore. She saw a man who had been lonely in his power, waiting for someone to be brave enough to sit on his lap and stay. She reached up, her hand covering his on her face. "I'm not going anywhere, Ji-hoon. Not because of a debt. Because I'm the only one who can keep you from being reckless." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I count on it." The fragile piece of the penthouse was shattered not by a bullet, but by a digital scream. Maya was deep in the encrypted architecture of the Seven Stars network when a high-priority alert bypassed her primary filters. It wasn't a system breach, it was a video file, sent through a ghost server that only a few people in Ji-hoon's inner circle knew how to access. Her blood turned to ice as the screen flickered to life. The setting was a damp, concrete basement, the kind of place where souls' shadows went to bury their secrets. In the center of the frame, tied to a rusted chair, was Sunwoo. He was bruised, his eyes wide with a frantic animal terror that Maya hadn't seen since they were children. Standing behind him was a man Maya recognized, Lee, Ji-hoon's most trusted lieutenant, the man who had stood beside them during the Hyatt Gala. Director Kim. Lee's voice was distorted, a digital rasp that felt like a serrated blade. The ghost boss is a sentimental fool. He thinks he can run an empire with a conscience, protecting the weak while the rest of us starve in his shadow. We don't want his blood. Yet. We want his keys. The biometric codes to his offshore holdings and the digital signatures of the export manifests. You have 60 minutes to upload them to this link, or your brother becomes a permanent part of the Han Rivers Foundation. The screen went black, leaving Maya's reflection staring back at her, pale and hollow. Her hands trembled over the keys. This was the calculation she had always feared. The binary choice between the man who had become her world and the brother who was her blood. The door behind her opened. Ji-hoon entered, his face still etched with the strain of his recovery, but his eyes instantly locked onto Maya's posture. He didn't need to see the screen, he could taste the betrayal in the air. He walked over, his hand resting on the back of her chair, his gaze dropping to the empty video player. "It's Lee," Maya whispered, her voice failing her. "He has Sunwoo. He wants the keys, Ji-hoon. Everything you've built. Everything you are." The silence that followed was absolute. Maya waited for the ghost boss to emerge, the man who would logically sacrifice a gambling addict to save a multi-billion-won empire. She waited for him to tell her that the debt was too high, that the Ice Queen needed to make the cold corporate choice. Instead, Ji-hoon knelt beside her chair, forcing her to look at him. His expression wasn't one of anger, but of a devastating, quiet clarity. "He's right about one thing, Maya. I am a fool. I spent years building these walls so that no one could ever get close enough to hurt me. And then you sat on my lap, and I realized I'd rather lose the empire than the person sitting on it." "Ji-hoon, no," she gasped. "If you give him those keys, you're dead. They won't just take the money. They'll take your head to prove they're the new kings." "Then we make sure they don't get the chance," he replied, his voice hardening into the lethal silk she knew so well. "You are the best digital security specialist in this country. You don't just build firewalls, Maya. You build traps." Lee thinks he's playing a game of leverage. He doesn't realize he's invited a wolf into his servers. Maya looked at the countdown ticking in the corner of her screen. 52 minutes. The conflict raged within her. The cynical girl who believed everyone had a price against the woman who had seen a man take a bullet for her. If she gave Lee what he wanted, she betrayed the only man who had ever truly protected her. If she refused, she signed her brother's death warrant. But as she looked into Ji-hoon's dark, unwavering eyes, she realized there was a third option. She wasn't just a victim or a hostage. She was Director Kim. She was the woman who lived in the spaces between legal and extra-legal. "I won't give him your keys," Maya said, her fingers finally finding their rhythm on the keyboard, her eyes turning into shards of flint. "I'm going to give him a Trojan horse that will burn his world to the ground from the inside out. But I need you to get to that basement. I need the ghost to be a distraction while I dismantle his soul." Ji-hoon stood up, reaching for the weapon he had set aside. "I'll get your brother, Maya. You just make sure that when Lee tries to open those gates, he finds hell waiting for him." The grand betrayal had begun, but as the code began to flow like liquid fire across her monitors, Maya knew she wasn't choosing between blood and loyalty. She was choosing to be the person Ji-hoon saw in her, the woman who didn't just survive the game, but rewrote the rules. The penthouse was silent, save for the hum of the cooling fans and the frantic rhythmic clacking of Maya's keyboard. Outside, The skyline of Seoul was a blur of static and neon, but inside the glow of 4 monitors, Maya was weaving a digital noose. The countdown in the corner of her screen hit 15 minutes. This was the musical chairs of the underworld, a game of shifting assets, disappearing chairs, and lethal timing. Lee was waiting for the keys to the kingdom. He expected a massive upload of biometric data and encrypted ledgers. Instead, Maya began to move Ji-hoon's empire into a state of flux. With the precision of a surgeon, she initiated a series of rapid-fire transfers, moving billions of won across a dozen shell companies in seconds. Every time Lee's trackers tried to pin down a source, Maya shifted the data to a new chair, leaving behind nothing but a ghost signal. She wasn't just hiding the money, she was using the movement to create a vacuum that would pull Lee's own hidden assets into the light. 10 minutes, Director. Lee's voice crackled through the comms, sounding smug. I see the packets moving. Don't be clever. Just let it land. It's a heavy load, Lee, Maya replied, her voice the epitome of corporate cool. If I drop the encryption too fast, the banks will flag the freeze. You want the money, or you want a frozen account? She could see him on the remote feed, Lee standing over Sunwoo in that damp basement staring at a tablet. Behind the scenes, Maya was doing more than moving money. She had localized the origin of Lee's signal. She was siphoning the rebel faction's own operational funds into a black hole account, effectively stripping them of their ability to pay the mercenaries currently surrounding Ji-hoon. On a secondary screen, she tracked Ji-hoon's GPS signal. He was a small, pulsing red dot moving through the industrial district, a lone predator entering the kill zone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her fingers remained steady. She had to time the final stop perfectly. If she pulled the chair too early, Lee would kill Sunwoo before Ji-hoon arrived. If she was too late, Lee would have the power to shut down the city's grid and vanish. Now, Maya whispered to herself. She executed the final command. In an instant, the billions she had been moving vanished from Lee's sight, locked behind a 512-bit encryption wall that only her biometric signature could break. Simultaneously, she triggered a cascading failure in the basement's security system. The electronic locks on the doors hummed and died, and the lights, Lee's only advantage, flickered into a blinding strobe-like madness. What is this? Lee screamed, his image on the screen glitching. Maya, what have you done? I changed the music, Lee, Maya said, her eyes cold as flint, and you're the only one without a seat. On the feed, the basement door blew inward. Ji-hoon appeared like a wraith through the strobe lights, a silhouette of vengeance. The mercenaries Lee had hired suddenly received a notification on their phones. The accounts Lee used to pay them had been emptied, and a fresh deposit, twice the size, had appeared from an anonymous source with a single instruction: stand down. Maya watched as the guns were lowered. Lee was left alone, clutching a useless tablet while Ji-hoon moved toward him with the slow, terrifying grace of a man who had already won. Maya didn't look away as Ji-hoon cut Sunwoo's ties. She didn't look away when Ji-hoon turned his gaze toward the camera, knowing she was watching from her obsidian throne miles away. The digital warfare was over. She had dismantled a coup with a series of keystrokes, protecting the man she loved and the brother who had nearly cost her everything. She leaned back, her hands finally trembling as the adrenaline ebbed. The Ice Queen had just burned down the underworld to save its king, and in the silence of the penthouse, she realized she had never felt more alive. The industrial dawn broke over Seoul in streaks of bruised purple and gold, but the air inside the penthouse remained cool and still. The digital hum of the monitors had finally softened to a rhythmic pulse, a heartbeat of a machine that had successfully survived the night. Maya sat at the obsidian desk, no longer huddled in the shadows of the study, but framed by the expansive glass of the living area. She had traded the torn velvet of the gala for a structured, charcoal-colored suit that bridged the gap between the corporate director she had been and the sovereign power she was becoming. The elevator chimed, the sound echoing through the vast space. Ji-hoon stepped out, his silhouette backlit by the rising sun. He looked weary, the bandage on his shoulder visible beneath a fresh black shirt. But his eyes held a clarity that Maya hadn't seen since the moment she landed on his lap. Behind him followed Sunwoo, pale and trembling, looking like a ghost who had finally realized he was alive. There were no grand speeches. Ji-hoon gestured toward the far end of the penthouse, where a private security detail was waiting to escort Sunwoo to Incheon International Airport. Maya stood, her heels clicking with a new, deliberate weight on the polished floor. She walked to her brother, looking into the eyes of the boy she had spent 3 years trying to save. "There is a plane waiting, Sunwoo," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the frantic desperation that had once defined her. "There is an account in Zurich with enough for a new life, but not enough to lose. If you ever return to Seoul, if you ever touch a deck of cards again, I won't be the one to find you. Do you understand?" Sunwoo nodded, a sob catching in his throat as he looked from Maya to the silent, lethal man standing behind her. He realized then that his sister wasn't just a captive of the ghost boss. She was the architect of the new order. As he was led away, Maya didn't watch him go. She turned her back on the past, her gaze fixing on Ji-hoon. "The debt is settled," Ji-hoon said, moving to stand beside her at the window. "The rebels are gone, the money is secure, and your brother is safe. You've fulfilled every term of our surrender, Maya. You're free." Maya looked out at the city, the skyscrapers of Gangnam beginning to glint as the sun climbed higher. She thought about the Ice Queen at Hanmu Electronics, the woman who lived for quarterly reports and sterile boardrooms. Then she thought about the woman who had dismantled an empire from a keyboard and danced in the arms of a king while the world burned. The binary code of her life had finally merged into a single, unbreakable stream of data. "I don't think I am," Maya whispered, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "I think free Maya would find Seoul very boring, and I think Hanmu Electronics isn't ready for a director who knows exactly how to liquidate their competition." Ji-hoon turned to her, his hand reaching out to cup the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the line where her hair met the silk of her collar. The touch was no longer an anchor or a brand, it was a partnership. "So, what does Director Kim want now?" "I want the seat next to yours," she said, her eyes meeting his with a flint-like intensity that matched his own. "I'm tired of being the secret, Ji-hoon. I'm tired of the after-hours version of me only existing in the dark. If we're going to run the city, I want them to see the woman who caught the ghost." Ji-hoon laughed, a low, genuine sound that wrapped around her like smoke. He led her back to the desk, but he didn't sit in the primary chair. Instead, he pulled out the second one, the one that had always sat slightly in the shadow, and moved it into the light, side by side with his own. As the city below fully awakened, the sovereign pair looked out over their kingdom. No longer an accident, no longer a debt, and no longer a secret. Maya leaned back, her hand resting over Ji-hoon's on the mahogany surface. She had come to the underworld to pay a price, but she had stayed to claim the prize. The game of musical chairs was over, and for the first time in her life, Maya wasn't just sitting in a seat. She was ruling from it. In this story, we learn that the most powerful versions of ourselves are often the ones we try hardest to hide. True sovereignty isn't found in a safe life, but in the courage to embrace our contradictions and find the person who isn't afraid of our light or our shadows. Stay bold, stay authentic, and remember, sometimes the best way to win the game is to stop playing by the rules and start writing your own.